Poleconomy. So I was somewhat mistaken. This is the British version, or the UK version, but it was originally, I think, published in Australia, and it was only published in the Commonwealth countries as far as I know. Anyway. I always light my pipe beforehand, but then it goes out too quickly on me while I'm talking. I have trouble talking while I've got a lit pipe. All right. So the first impression that I had when I took a look at this and started playing it, or started reading the rules with intention to play, was, what the hell have I gotten myself into? Doesn't look like there's much game here. You know, it's less than Monopoly in terms of moving around on the board and all that, and there's almost nothing on the political. How can this be fun? What's the enjoyment? Well, you know what? That's a similar thought that I had with Crusoe's Planet, and my end reaction is also similar. I think this is actually really interesting because of the dynamics of the multiplayer deal making and how much power you have with taxation laws and with some of the prime minister's abilities, etc., to just screw around with the government funding. You have a lot more of an interesting game than it initially looks like when you start thinking about, well, what is, the actual game rules allow you to do, sort of what's spelled out in the game rules. There's almost nothing there. It's very simple. So that's kind of an interesting thing. The two games I would compare it the closest to are Crusoe's Planet, which has a somewhat more detailed and interesting kind of production mechanism, something Euro-like in terms of, hey, I gotta get these things, I gotta feed my people, this kind of stuff and everything, but still ends up, leveraging a lot of that. What can the players accomplish between them, rather than just one person building their own little empire? Can you specialize in certain things? And then what kind of advantages accrue to the people who specialize in the things that are rarer or harder to get? On the other hand, the things that are more important, like, say, simple food, well, if that stuff doesn't get out, that's a big deal. Well, in this, there's nothing like that. There's not all those different paths to look at, and it is a less interesting game, I think, from my memory of Crusoe's Planet, which is a long time ago that I played it. I should get that going with the group here. I think some of them at least would really get a kick out of it. Maybe most of the guys that I think I'll be usually playing with will really get a kick out of it. But this doesn't provide you with that much. But what it does, with the simple roll and move type of thing, and with no real goals in terms of, there's nothing specific. You don't even want to collect sets like you do in Monopoly, so there's nothing to kind of guide trading in that way. And the politics ends up ruled by, hey, roll some dice, see who has how many points, and see if they can put together some kind of agreement of points. The points aren't something that accrue from the game. What that means is the game has a tremendous random factor to it, which is, towards the end of the game, a coalition could seize the government, raise taxes up to the extreme, and then split that money amongst themselves. Or somebody got the government on their own, which they could through a ridiculously high roll, because doubles allow you to roll again and keep adding. They could end up with a lot, just being able to grab the entire government treasury, and they could create that government treasury if they have enough time. So there's a lot of difficulty there. Of course, if a new government comes in place and somebody's caused that kind of problem, first of all, by the rules, you could individually target them and say, well, tell you what, Enrico, you were doing really well. If you if anybody named Enrico is around during taxation, they pay all their cash. Just as a, screw you because you ran away with money. I don't really like doing that. But I gotta tell you, with what I saw at the end of the game, where they just kind of handed out a couple £1,000,000 each, in a sense, I could see a law being passed against someone in the sense that some kind of criminal, actions, whether they're going to be held accountable for a level of bribery and corruption that they exhibited before, not just allowed to sit on it. The game doesn't provide any mechanisms for a legal recourse or anything. All it gives you is that government. So, given the abstraction of the game, it may actually make sense to be able to target that way. I kind of didn't allow that throughout most of the game. Made people make taxation rules that didn't target individuals, but targeted attributes that only those individuals might have. So you could have hit, anybody with a 70 basic income. Well, only one player's allowed to have each basic income, so boom, there you have it. So I guess it doesn't make a difference anyway, right? If you're going to allow that. Anyway, it doesn't have anywhere near the kind of underpinnings that a junta-like game has, which is far, far more than Crusoe's Planet does. But it still manages to capture a lot of that kind of feeling of this deal cutting and hoping that you can kind of get a cut through it. There is a limit to how weak you can go in a game. This game, I think, manages to avoid that limit. I have another game which is called the Cities game. It's by Psychology Today, I think. And I don't have it here. It's not even in Phoenix. It's across continent at my mom's basement. And I have no idea when and if those games will ever be in my dirty hands again. Yes, my hands are always dirty. It's the pipe. But that particular game puts you in kind of a, kind of a prisoner's dilemma type of deal where you're just, making these decisions. Yes, I'll go with this. And it's just that kind of quandary that's constantly being played on you. And the way it actually works out is, first of all, you could solve that game theoretically, and you can't with this. This doesn't have any simple solution to it like that. You can solve each problem game theoretically, but that doesn't really work. Like, if you start applying game theory to actual operations, people don't work that way, and therefore the game theory just ends up getting broken in many cases. So these weren't ones where one choice dominates the others. There is a possibility that people will make choices which are not optimal under the game theory, but which work well together. However, there wasn't enough game there to make it actually fun to play or whatever. It just ended up being 4 people voting up or down on something more or less. And someone would get the advantage, so it almost always would fail. And there wasn't a clear, as there is in here, I think, there wasn't a clear everybody loses condition to be contrasted with what happens if somebody wins. So that left you in kind of a fuzzier area that I feel like games with a semi-co-op type flavor leave you in. You had this, well, the city will be richer, but the rich haven't bilked the poor as much as they could have. And it doesn't really define much. I think the winning defines what share of the goods you have, while the rich will almost invariably destroy things in that game. Anyway, I don't remember that game well enough. I'd love to try it, but it's pure hidden choice type thing. So, although there's negotiation beforehand, so it's a tough game to solo. But this thing, solo's okay, although that's not how you'd want to play it. let's talk a little about the components, I guess. I don't know if I've said anything about the game, actually. I have a little newspaper, and it's a cute gimmick. My wife loves it. This is the roll set. I would much rather something more standard, I think, that's easier to manipulate, but whatever. The board, which is a roll and move type thing, and it's got a problem. There's no easy way to distinguish who owns what. The players will hold company cards, advertising cards. They're not really as distinctive as the color-coded cards in Monopoly. And there's a fair number of them, and they don't really stick in your head. Monopoly can get away with the names that it has and stuff because it's iconic. This is not, and there's not going to be a lot to help remind you where the Ford Motor Company versus the Ford Media Company or Ford Motor Company Insurance or something like that, financing, are. And there's just not much to really link the locations on the board, and the double-decker board doesn't make it any easier, I'm sure. So what I did, if you watch my playthrough, was I used for company and advertising, which look even more similar, I think. I don't know. These aren't even advertising companies, are they? No. So for example, this one, it's an advertising for a company. It's not an advertising company, yet you're buying advertising. It doesn't indicate the company or anything like that. It's not linked to the company that's on the board or anything like that. It's not like fast food franchise in that way. Anyway, what it ends up being is, for me at least, I really, really want it to have some kind of indicator on the board. And the color pieces, I found discs from Age of Steam or whatever. You're probably going to want some kind of little pieces to use to mark who owns what. You can still keep the deeds because they make it easier to add up for taxation, etc. Anyway, I guess the sort of conclusion of it all is it wasn't disappointing. It wasn't astonishingly good. So I want something that's more of a simulation. I already have Crusoe's Planet. I already have Junta. I have games which allow for these kind of dynamics, and I don't feel like this one particularly represents the political realities of how businesses influence politics, and politics comes back and influences the business. That's the question I really wanted to look at and was hoping that this game would answer. And when I asked, somewhere for suggestions, this one came up. It looked kind of interesting, but it doesn't really show that relationship. What it shows instead is politics is this random game that the companies are somehow able to manipulate to their own ends, but they kind of all get to manipulate it in the same sort of way. So you don't have the idea of like altruistic type public faces to companies that try to make, and maybe it's more than just the public face, but that try to get a popular support for certain ideas that are not just things that are in their best interest. So when an oil company is putting funding into global warming research to debunk it, although most of them cut their funding because they were proving the case instead, what you have is the kind of influence that I'm interested in. But there's another kind, because you take a reputational hit if it's found that you're kind of maybe skewing the research in such a manner. even just funding things that will help prove your point, that are in your favor, isn't necessarily going to be good for your public image. And that's the kind of thing I wanted to look at, as well as, yeah, and I have no idea what the game would look like, you know. So I was willing to give this a shot, but this isn't. This is more about at what point a democratic government influenced by economic oligarchs becomes a kleptocracy. And the answer seems to be whenever possible, and definitely before the end of the game, whatever that is. Unfortunately, other games that I have, the only one that I can think of that really sort of heads in the direction that I'm talking about is the Lords of the Sierra Madre, which handles kind of electoral politics, etc., as a very, very abstract thing. You spend money, you roll some dice to get a political power. But the effects of winning the political power are valuable. What I want is maybe something between, you know, not Road to the White House, that's too detailed on a single election, but maybe something along the lines of 1960, the Making of the President, or some of the 4-player versions that I've seen of that, intermingled with special interests. Another thing that would fit in nicely is Founding Fathers, which the Rick Kelly game, which I'd like, although the business interests early in that game probably aren't big enough to have much of an effect, but I understand the game goes until the Civil War, maybe past it now. And if you're starting to get into that Gilded era, you're starting to get to where the government was controlled in a different way. And I'm kind of thinking something along those lines, where there's an electoral situation and an economic situation. And then the question is, of course, well, you know, what is victory? And that could be dependent. So, for example, take the Koch brothers in modern day. Are they more interested in making money for themselves? I mean, they have tons of money, what the hell do they care, but they wouldn't like to lose it all. Or are they more interested in their philosophical and ideological beliefs? And that could be something where you have kind of hidden victory conditions, where people maybe, you know, have a certain ideological setup that they want to work towards, and they get some points for that, and they have economic goals that they want to reach, that they get certain goals for, and they have to kind of balance them and get their points, and nobody knows what anybody else has. And then they start building business and political empires based on these. And they can be kind of coteries or whatever. It doesn't have to be, you know, just one family or whatever, in which they're trying to achieve these goals on multiple dimensions. And some may care more about one than the other, obviously. And I think there could be a very interesting design there, one in which the politics can benefit the business, and the business has strong influences on the politics as time goes on, that would be really neat, and that something that I'd really love to see designed well, which is a good reason for me not to try it. Anyway, this one, you know, did better. It didn't manage to meet any of those needs, but it did better as a Crusoe's Planet, or to some extent Junta type game, where you're trying to seize all the money. Everybody's got the same base victory conditions. Shanghai Trader, on a very, very light framework. And that's one of the interesting things that you could do, is that a game, if you allow enough player interaction, enough screwing with even the base rules of the game by the players, and in this way you do with the taxation, etc., being set almost, you know, freely at will, well, you start to get an interesting game that just emerges out of very, very little. And I don't know how many games you'd want that give you that kind of freedom, but it's awfully cool for that, for some degree of that to be out there. Uh, I think I used to play Canadian Civil War, giving players the right to kind of break the rules on a vote. The game doesn't quite allow that on the rules as written, but it tries to imply that there are, you know, things that the players can change, but there really isn't a lot that they can change. There's not a lot that looks ambiguous in the rules, at least to my eye. And that's what you're supposed to be able to vote on, is rules ambiguities. And I just kind of allowed rules changes. And that could allow the same kind of really devastating shakeups to the whole system, which could be, I find that kind of thing really fascinating when you get to play that out. But I think on something this light, it's especially apropos to do it, because it's not like you have to learn a whole lot of rules, and it is a little bit longer of a game than I would probably like for what it is. Maybe take some of the cash out of it. It's not like all the properties have to sell or anything. Anyway, certainly more interesting than a quick look at the rules would have indicated, even if it's not what I would dream I wanted.